Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a castle. Not the ruin you might find crumbling quietly at the edge of a field today, its stones softened by centuries of rain, its towers open to the sky. Not the decorated version from paintings or illustrated manuscripts, sharp and idealized, every turret perfect. Imagine it as it was, alive, full, breathing. It is late afternoon in England, sometime in the 14th century. October, perhaps. The kind of October that arrives with a sudden heaviness, where the light turns gold too early and the shadows come creeping long across the courtyard before supper. The castle sits on a rise above a river valley. Its walls are the colour of wet limestone, pale grey and thick, and the smoke rising from its chimneys is white against a sky the colour of pewter. From a distance it looks silent. From a distance it always does. But step closer. Walk across the wooden bridge over the moat. Pass under the gatehouse where the iron teeth of the portcullis hang overhead like a frozen jaw, and enter the outer courtyard. The silence dissolves. There is the heavy thud of hooves on packed earth, the bark of a dog, the clatter of carts being unloaded near the storehouse, the distant ring of a hammer from the smithy. Someone shouts a name across the yard and is answered by laughter. A cluster of geese moves with offended dignity around the base of a water trough. The castle is not a monument. It is a household. A living, complicated, constantly moving household, and it runs on something as fundamental as breath itself. It runs on food. In the great hall above you, if you were invited in, and you likely would not be, you would find long trestle tables, the high dais where the lord and his family sit elevated above everyone else, the smell of rushes and beeswax, and the particular dusty warmth of a space that is always slightly too full of people. On feast days, the great hall would glitter with candlelight and the noise of 100 voices, and the tables would groan under the weight of platters and dishes and ewers of wine. It would look from the outside like abundance appearing from nowhere, like magic. It is not magic. It is labour. Tremendous, relentless, skilled, invisible labour. And it all happens somewhere else. Follow the passage behind the dais. Step through a door that most guests never open, down a short corridor that smells of wood smoke and something deeper, something animal and herbal and faintly sweet, and you arrive somewhere that the songs never mention and the illuminated manuscripts rarely bother to depict. You arrive in the kitchen. And what a place it is. In a great castle of the 14th century, the kitchen is not a single room tucked behind the dining hall, the way a modern kitchen might be. It is a complex, a world unto itself. It may occupy one or more separate stone buildings, joined to the main castle by covered passages or open walkways, positioned deliberately downwind from the great hall, and set apart from the main body of the castle, because fire is constant here, and fire in the wrong place means everything ends. The kitchen is where the castle is truly made every single day. Not in the Lord's chamber, not in the chapel, not on the practice ground with swords and shields, but here, in this warm and smoky and astonishingly busy place where the work never really stops. What hits you first when you step inside is the heat. Even on a cold October afternoon, the kitchen is warm in a way that feels like entering another climate entirely. The fireplaces, and there are several, some of them large enough for a grown person to stand upright inside, breathe out a steady, rolling warmth that wraps around you immediately and fills your chest with the smell of burning oak and rendered fat. The ceiling is high and dark with smoke. The walls stained the deep amber brown of centuries of cooking fires. Hooks hang from iron bars above the central hearth, and from those hooks hang pots, chains, and the gleaming rods of the great spits. The floor is stone, worn smooth in certain paths where feet have travelled the same routes 10,000 times. Everywhere you look, someone is doing something. A boy crouches by a fire, his face bright pink with heat, turning the handle of a spit where a joint of meat turns slowly and drips fat into a pan below. Two men in heavy linen aprons work at a wide wooden table, one chopping something dark and aromatic, the other pounding something in a stone mortar with a rhythm as steady and repetitive as a heartbeat. A woman moves past, carrying a wooden bucket of water so heavy it has pulled her shoulder down. Near the back wall, where a second, smaller fire burns beneath a domed stone oven, a man in a flour-dusted apron slides a long wooden paddle into the darkness and withdraws it with a round golden loaf. The smell of that bread, warm and yeasty and slightly sweet, cuts through everything else for just a moment, and then the smoke takes over again. This is the kitchen. Not the place of silence and order that the great hall above suggests, not the polished and ceremonial face of the castle. This is its engine, its lungs, its daily and unglamorous miracle. We are going to spend some time here tonight. We are going to move slowly through this world, room by room, fire by fire, roll by roll, and let the sounds and the warmth and the long, patient rhythms of this place settle around you. There is nothing alarming here, nothing urgent, only the slow, steady pulse of a world in which food is the centre of everything, and where the work of feeding people is taken with a seriousness and a skill that modern kitchens, for all their technology, can only partly understand. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. The fire is warm. The bread is baking. The mortar is still. The scullion by the hearth is half asleep. And the day, for the moment, is long and quiet and very, very old. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say something to you. This channel, Hayo, Boring History for Sleep, has been something I have been quietly building for over a year now. Over a year of researching, writing, recording, and editing these long, slow journeys through history. And I am genuinely grateful for everyone who has found their way here. At the time of making this video, the channel has around 160 subscribers. That is a small number in the world of YouTube, but it means the world to me. If these calm, detailed stories from the distant past help you drift off to sleep, I would love it if you would consider leaving a like and subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it helps more than you might imagine. And if you are feeling generous with your support, there are ways to help the channel grow described in the links below. Now, back to the kitchen. Section 2. The architecture of the kitchen. The heart of the kitchen is the fireplace. This is not just a primordial feature, but an architectural statement. It is usually constructed of stone and is twice as wide as the regular chimney. It is so large that some or even all of the workers can sit inside it. It is here that the engines of power are operated, the cooking of food and the heating of water. Outside the fireplace are the doors of the ovens. These are typically sectioned of white stone and are 2 or 3 reaches wide. They are constructed with a circular top, and some are built a few feet above the floor. The granite of these ovens is quite worn and is usually polished somewhat. The side of the oven doors is dented or scratched to prevent food from slipping off. The fireplace of the kitchen is also a place where the spices of the divine office is kept, namely the psalm, the hymn, and the praise. The wake of the kitchen is considered a sign of faithfulness. If the psalm is sung from a chair or from a fold, then the psalm is sung while dancing. The true prayer is sung by means of dancing, and the psalm is sung with gentleness. The prayer is also a place where the psalm is sung and the hymn is unfolded. The prayer is also a place where the psalm is sung and the hymn. The first thing to understand about the kitchen of a great 14th century castle is that it was almost certainly not where you would expect it to be. If you have ever visited a large medieval castle, walked its passages, peered into its rooms, tried to make sense of the way one space connects to another, you may have noticed that the kitchen is often awkward to find. Not because it was hidden exactly, but because it was separated, deliberately placed at a remove from the parts of the castle where fire would be catastrophic. Fire was the existential threat to any medieval building. Timber roofs, straw-covered floors, candles and torches burning in every room, and now a series of enormous, constantly blazing hearths, producing not just heat, but fat spatter and sparks, and the unpredictable behaviour of open flame at any hour of the day or night. The solution, adopted in increasingly sophisticated ways throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, was simple in principle and complex in execution. You built the kitchen as a separate structure. In many great English castles and noble households of the 14th century, the kitchen occupied a distinct stone building, or a series of connected buildings joined to the main hall by a covered passageway, sometimes called a screens passage, that funneled the food from kitchen to table while keeping the heat and the smoke and the risk of fire away from the central domestic spaces. At Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, which was extensively developed in the mid to late 14th century under John of Gaunt, the kitchen was placed as a separate block. The kitchens at Portchester Castle in Hampshire survive in partial form and show a similarly separated arrangement. The Abbot's kitchen at Glastonbury Abbey, built in the 1330s, making it a perfect contemporary example, though monastic rather than aristocratic, still stands almost complete today, and it is a remarkable structure. A square stone building with a great central hearth and an ingenious system of corner fireplaces that vented smoke up through the walls and out through an octagonal lantern at the apex of the roof. That Glastonbury kitchen measures roughly 33 feet square on the interior. The kitchen at Kenilworth, described in historical accounts, was significantly larger. The guidebook notes dimensions of around 66 feet by 28 feet, substantially larger than most aristocratic kitchens of the period. These were not small domestic species. They were, by any measure, industrial premises, operating on a scale that is difficult to appreciate until you stand inside one and try to imagine it full of people, full of fire, full of noise. The stone walls were thick, often 2 to 3 feet, not only for structural reasons, but because thick walls helped to moderate the extreme temperature fluctuations of a working kitchen. In winter, that mattered enormously to the people working inside. The floor was typically stone as well, sometimes paved with flat flags, sometimes, in the more sophisticated kitchens of the later 14th century, tiled with baked clay tiles. What is remarkable about the better appointed castle kitchens is that they included drainage. A channel or pipe set into the floor, running toward an outside drain, allowed the floor to be washed after heavy cooking sessions. This was not universal, and it should not make us think of medieval kitchens as particularly hygienic by modern standards, but it does suggest a degree of practical design thinking that is often overlooked when people imagine the medieval world as simply dirty and haphazard. Ventilation was the other great architectural concern. Smoke, if not properly managed, would not simply be unpleasant, it would make the kitchen impossible to work in, and it posed its own fire hazard. The solution varied by building. The simplest arrangement was a large louver, a wooden or stone structure on the roof with adjustable vanes that allowed smoke to escape while limiting the entry of rain. More sophisticated kitchens had dedicated flues built into the masonry above each fireplace, drawing the smoke upward and out through the roof. The Glastonbury solution, with its octagonal timber lantern above the central hearth, was particularly elegant. You can still look up through it today and see the sky, and it is not difficult to imagine the haze of smoke spiralling upward through it on a busy cooking day, carrying with it the smells of roasting pork, of baking bread, of herbs thrown onto hot coals. Light was always a challenge. The kitchen was generally a ground floor building, which meant that by the conventions of earlier castle architecture, it was not supposed to have large windows. Windows at ground level were defensive liabilities. Earlier medieval kitchens were accordingly dim, lit mainly by the light of the fires and by rushlights or tallow candles placed at intervals along the walls. But in the later 13th and 14th centuries, as castles evolved from pure military instruments into comfortable and sometimes magnificent residences, this began to change. Glazed windows, actual glass, a real luxury, began to appear in ground floor rooms of the better appointed households. High, narrow windows set into thick walls admitted daylight without compromising security. In a working kitchen where precision mattered, where a cook needed to assess the colour of a sauce, the doneness of a crust, the precise moment a custard set, light was not a luxury, it was a practical necessity. The kitchen complex rarely consisted of only one room. In a great household, the kitchen building proper, where the main cooking fires burned, was surrounded and supported by a cluster of subsidiary spaces. The bakehouse, with its separate bread ovens, was typically close at hand, sometimes sharing a wall, sometimes a distinct building immediately adjacent. The brewhouse, where ale was produced almost daily, sat nearby. The larder, a cold storage room for raw meat, fish, and preserved foods, was positioned away from the heat of the main kitchen, often on a north-facing wall or in a lower, cooler part of the building complex. The pantry and buttery, which we will visit in detail later, connected the kitchen to the great hall above, forming the critical link between production and service. Walking through such a complex today, in the quiet of a modern visit to a restored castle, it is easy to miss the accumulated logic of it all. Every door, every threshold, every window placement was a decision made in response to the practical realities of cooking for a large household every single day. The people who designed these spaces, and by the 14th century they were genuinely designed, not simply accumulated, understood heat management, understood smoke, understood the flow of work through a kitchen, the way a modern architect might think about the flow of customers through a building. They were solving real problems with the materials and knowledge available to them. And they solved them well enough that the food arrived at the great hall warm, plentiful, and arranged with a care and deliberateness that the assembled company accepted as simply the order of things. The labour behind it was invisible. The architecture made it so. Section 3. The hierarchy of the kitchen. Every institution has its order, and the kitchen of a 14th century castle was no exception. If anything, the kitchen was more rigidly hierarchical than almost any other space in the castle, more clearly stratified than the great hall above, where at least the social ranks were mixed together in the same room, however carefully they were seated. In the kitchen, your position was your identity. The work you did, the fire you tended, the task you were assigned from the moment you entered each morning, all of it told the world exactly where you stood in the order of things. And the order of things in a medieval castle kitchen was precise, carefully maintained, and not lightly disturbed. At the summit of the kitchen hierarchy stood the chief cook. This was a person of genuine consequence, not merely a domestic servant in any lowly sense, but a skilled professional whose expertise was recognized and rewarded accordingly. A talented chief cook in a great noble household could command a salary that compared favorably with other senior household officers. He, and in the great castle kitchens of the 14th century, the chief cook was almost invariably male, though women did work in some kitchen roles, particularly in smaller households, was responsible for everything that came out of the kitchen. The planning of menus, the ordering of supplies, the management of the kitchen staff, the timing and execution of meals for ordinary days and for the great feasts that punctuated the year. He answered to the steward of the household, who managed the castle's domestic affairs overall, but within the kitchen itself, the chief cook's authority was absolute. By the time he had risen to that position, the chief cook had typically spent many years working his way through the kitchen hierarchy, and he would by then have done very little of the actual cooking himself. His role was supervisory, administrative, creative in the planning of menus, and disciplinary when the complex machinery of the kitchen threatened to break down. He knew how everything was done because he had done all of it at some earlier point in his career. He could assess the quality of a sauce with a single taste, recognize when a roast had been turned unevenly, and identify the precise moment a boiled custard was ready to be removed from the fire. This knowledge, accumulated over years of work and failure and repetition, was what made him valuable. Directly beneath the chief cook was a layer of specialist cooks, each responsible for a particular domain of the kitchen's output. The roast cook managed the great spits and the open hearths, the most dramatic and physically demanding aspect of medieval cooking. The boiling cook oversaw the great cauldrons and pots that produced the pottages, soups, and boiled meats that formed the bulk of every day's meals. The sauce cook prepared the elaborate condiments and sauces that were considered essential to any respectable meal in a noble household. Complex preparations that could involve dozens of ingredients and considerable skill to produce consistently. The pastry cook worked in and around the bread oven, responsible not only for bread, but for the pies, tarts, wafers, and baked goods that appeared on the table at every meal. In a very grand household, a royal court, or the residence of one of England's great magnates, there might also be a dedicated confectioner producing sweetmeats and preserves, and a separate garde-manger responsible for cold preparations and the management of raw materials coming in from the larder. The larderer held a position that was less about cooking and more about supply and preservation. The larder, from the old French lardier, related to lard, meaning fat or bacon, was the cold storage room where raw meat and preserved foods were kept, and the larderer was responsible for managing this stock. He oversaw the salting and smoking of meat, the storage of dried fish, the packing of lard and butter into sealed containers. He had to understand preservation, had to be able to assess the condition of stored food, and had to maintain records of what was available and in what quantity. In a large household, this was genuinely demanding administrative work. The poulterer handled birds, an enormous category in the medieval diet. Chickens, geese, ducks, herons, swans, cranes, peacocks, larks, and a dozen other species of bird passed through the poulterer's hands to be plucked, dressed, and prepared according to whatever the chief cook had planned. Game birds taken on the hunt arrived here first. Exotic birds destined for impressive feast displays. A roasted peacock redressed in its own plumage, for instance, which was a genuine feature of spectacular medieval feasts, were the poulterer's particular responsibility. The butler and the pantler, while not strictly kitchen staff, worked in such close coordination with the kitchen that they formed part of the same functional world. The butler, from the old French bouteiller, keeper of bottles, was responsible for the household's drink. He managed the buttery, which was not a room for keeping butter, but a room for keeping bottles and barrels, and he supervised the service of wine, ale, and other beverages to the great hall. The pantler was responsible for the pantry, specifically for the household's supply of bread and the linens associated with table service. His relationship with the bakehouse was correspondingly close. Below all the specialist roles came the undercooks, experienced kitchen workers who could perform a range of tasks but had not yet achieved a specialist position. Below them came the kitchen boys, a catch-all category that included anyone young enough or new enough to be assigned the most basic work: fetching and carrying, tending fires, delivering messages between kitchen departments, running to the storehouse or the garden. And at the very bottom of the kitchen hierarchy, a position so lowly it was sometimes used as an insult, as when Chaucer's summoner calls someone a scullion to express contempt, were the scullions. Young boys, typically between 10 and 14 years of age, tasked with the perpetual, back-breaking, thankless work of cleaning, scrubbing pots, scouring pans, carrying away waste, keeping the kitchen floor clear of the constant accumulation of droppings, scraps, and the unavoidable mess of a busy working kitchen. We will spend more time with them later. This hierarchy was not merely social ceremony, it was functional. A kitchen producing multiple courses of food for 100 or more people, cooking simultaneously over several fires with dozens of different dishes at various stages of preparation, required coordination of extraordinary complexity. The hierarchy was the mechanism by which that coordination was achieved. Each person knew their task, knew their station, knew who they answered to and what was expected of them. The chief cook's authority was not luxury or vanity, it was the organizational backbone of a system that had to function perfectly every single day, or people would go hungry. In the medieval world, that was not a trivial consequence. The social world of the kitchen was also a world of small competitions and carefully maintained professional pride. The sauce cook who produced a particularly excellent cameline sauce, the baker whose manchet loaves were consistently lighter and finer than those of his predecessor,
The roast cook whose timing was so reliable that a joint never came to the table over or underdone. These were people who cared about their work in the way that skilled practitioners always care. Not because anyone was watching, but because the work itself demanded it. The kitchen was a place where competence was visible every day, and incompetence was equally visible. You could not hide poor cooking behind ceremony or rank. The food arrived at the table and told its own truth, and the people who made it knew that and took it seriously. Section 4. The Great Hearths. Fire as the centre of everything.
Of all the things that defined a medieval castle kitchen, its size, its smells, its noise, its people, nothing defined it more completely than fire. Fire was not one feature of the kitchen among many. It was the kitchen. Everything else, the tables, the tools, the staff, the stores, was organized around fire, in service to fire, made possible by fire. To understand the medieval kitchen is first and most importantly to understand what it meant to cook over an open flame every single day, for every single meal, without exception, for the entirety of the period we are discussing. The kitchen stove, as we know it, an enclosed iron structure with a controlled combustion chamber and an adjustable heat source, did not exist in the 14th century. It would not appear until the 18th century, and its full domestication did not happen until the 19th. In the 14th century, all cooking involved the direct, immediate, and sometimes violent application of fire. You placed your pot in the fire, over the fire, or directly on coals raked from the fire. You turned your meat on a spit that rotated above the fire. You slid your bread into an oven that had been heated by burning fuel inside it and then reeked clear before the dough went in, the residual heat of the masonry doing the actual baking. Everywhere you looked, there was fire, and learning to work with it, to read its heat, to manage its behavior, to coax it and contain it, and never, never let it get away from you, was the foundational skill of anyone who worked in a kitchen. In a great castle kitchen, there would be multiple hearths, each serving a different purpose, each requiring constant attention. The main roasting hearth was the largest, typically built into one wall of the kitchen, sometimes large enough that you could stand inside it to adjust the spit without crouching. This was the great prestige fire, the one that turned the whole joints of meat that appeared on the high table, the one whose light and heat dominated the kitchen, and whose management required the most skilled and experienced hands. The opening of the fireplace was wide and deep, with iron andirons, sometimes called fire dogs, set a foot or more apart to support the logs, and with a fire crane or an iron bracket from which pots could be suspended over the heat on adjustable chains. Beside the main hearth, or along another wall, would be the boiling hearths, slightly smaller fires over which the great iron cauldrons hung on their pothooks. These were the workhorses of the medieval kitchen, responsible for the enormous quantities of pottage, stock, stewed meat, and boiled vegetables that fed the majority of the household every day.
The cauldrons themselves were formidable objects, cast iron, thick-walled, heavy enough that moving them when full required 2 people and considerable care. They sat over their fires for hours at a time, their contents stirred periodically by whoever was assigned to them, releasing steam in fragrant columns that rose to the smoke-darkened ceiling.
There were also smaller, more portable arrangements of fire. Trivets, which were 3-legged iron stands that could be placed directly over coals raked to the side of the main hearth, supporting smaller pots and skillets for sauces and delicate preparations that required closer control than the great cauldrons allowed. Chafing dishes, shallow metal bowls filled with coals, kept food warm after cooking, allowing dishes to be held at temperature while other elements of a meal were completed. And there were the long-handled pans, the frying implements, the flat griddles, all the tools of a working kitchen that required direct contact with heat and which demanded their operators' complete and experienced attention. The fuel for all of this was wood, and the consumption of wood in a large castle kitchen was staggering. A major noble household in the 14th century could burn through many cartloads of firewood every week. This was not a minor logistical concern. It was a constant preoccupation of the household steward, who had to ensure that fuel supplies were maintained at adequate levels, that wood was delivered and stacked and dried before it was needed, and that the kitchen did not suddenly find itself without fuel in the middle of preparing a feast. The management of fuel was as important as the management of food, and the 2 problems were inseparable. Wood was not all equal. Hardwoods, oak especially, but also ash and hornbeam, burned long and hot and were preferred for the main cooking fires. Softer woods, like alder or willow, burned faster and at lower heat, useful for lighter tasks. Charcoal, made from wood burned slowly in covered pits until most of the volatile gases had been driven off, burned hotter and with less smoke than raw wood, and was preferred for delicate cooking tasks and for the production of very high temperatures when needed. A supply of charcoal was valuable enough to be carefully accounted for in household records. The fire had to be managed from before dawn to after midnight, and someone in the kitchen was always responsible for it. In large households, fire watch was a specific assigned duty, a person whose job it was to ensure that the fires were properly lit and maintained, that the wood supply was adequate, and that the dangerous combination of heat, fat, and enclosed stone space did not produce the disaster that everyone in a castle perpetually feared. A fire in the kitchen that spread to the covered passage, or worse, to the great hall, could destroy in an afternoon what had taken years to build. The consciousness of that risk was always present. And yet the fire was also beautiful. In quiet moments, when the kitchen was briefly less frantic, in the middle of a long afternoon, when the main meal had been served, and the next preparations had not yet begun in earnest, the hearths burned with a steady, patient warmth that filled the room with orange light and the peaceful sound of wood settling
and spitting. The stone walls reflected the glow. The hanging pots were still. The smoke rose in slow, undulating columns toward the high ceiling. For a few minutes, the kitchen was the warmest and most peaceful room in the entire castle. And then someone came through the door with a delivery, or a junior cook began setting up for supper, and the fire was brought up again, and the noise and the heat and the wonderful, relentless busyness of it all began once more.
The tools associated with managing the fire were themselves a small world of specialized craftsmanship. The fire irons, pokers for shifting burning logs, rakes for managing coals, tongs for moving hot material without direct contact, were made by the castle's own blacksmith and were heavy, practical objects bearing no decorative ambition whatsoever. The fire crane, a pivoting arm of iron fixed into the masonry beside the hearth, allowed pots suspended from it to be swung in toward the heat or out away from it, without the operator having to reach into the fire itself. This was an important safety device as much as a convenience, and a well-made fire crane that swung smoothly and held its position precisely was valued by every cook who worked with one. The adjustable pot hook, a series of linked hooks of different lengths that allowed a cauldron to be raised or lowered above the fire in small increments, gave the cook a meaningful degree of control over the intensity of heat applied to whatever was cooking in the vessel above. Bellows were essential for bringing a fire up quickly from low embers. In a working kitchen, the bellows were used constantly to raise a flame that had died down during the preparation of a previous dish, to increase the heat under a cauldron that was taking too long to come to the boil, or to bring the roasting fire to full intensity when a large joint had just been mounted on the spit. The large floor-standing bellows used in castle kitchens were robust, double-action devices that produced a steady stream of air with each stroke, and their rhythmic wheezing was part of the constant background soundscape of the working kitchen. Using them required a certain technique, a good steady pumping motion that delivered air consistently rather than in fitful blasts that could scatter burning embers across the floor. And everyone in the kitchen learned it early. Perhaps the most underappreciated feature of the medieval kitchen fire was the ash it produced in enormous quantities every single day. Ash from hardwood fires was not simply waste, it was a raw material with multiple uses. Mixed with water and animal fat, it produced lye, a strongly alkaline substance used as a cleaning agent and as the base material for making soap. The kitchen's ash pile, carefully maintained outside the kitchen building, was a resource that fed into the household's cleaning and washing operations. What could not be used was spread on the kitchen garden as a soil amendment. Nothing was discarded without thought. In winter, the kitchen fires took on an additional social dimension. They were the warmest spaces in the castle, and the cold months in a stone building with no heating beyond fireplaces and
body warmth were genuinely brutal. Kitchen workers who could find a legitimate reason to linger near the hearth after their assigned tasks were done did so without apology. The scullion drying his hands at the edge of the roasting fire, the undercook who found one more pot to stir, one more preparation to check, one more reason to remain in the warm a few minutes longer before braving the passage to the cold servants' quarters. The kitchen's warmth was not merely physical comfort. In the depths of an English winter, with the wind driving rain against the stone walls and the temperature in the unheated passages dropping to near freezing by night, it was something close to survival. The fire was generous in this way, as it was generous in every other way. It gave heat and light and the means of transforming raw ingredients into nourishing food. It demanded constant attention and carried constant risk. It was the most important thing in the kitchen and the most dangerous. And every person who worked in that room understood both of those facts in their bones. And it is one of the many reasons why, even now, when the stone is cold and the hearths are long dead, the memory of those kitchens carries a particular warmth. The warmth of something that was genuinely, essentially, and without any exaggeration, alive. Section 5. The bakehouse. Bread, the foundation of every meal.
If fire was the heart of the kitchen, then bread was the heart of the meal. Not as a side dish, not as an accompaniment, not as a preliminary nibble placed on the table before the serious business of eating began, but as the literal and structural foundation of every meal consumed in the castle, from the highest lord to the lowest scullion. In the 14th century, bread was not optional. It was the central food, the caloric anchor of the medieval diet, and the bakehouse that produced it was one of the most important and most continuously active spaces in the entire castle complex. The bread oven was a structure of considerable mass, built from stone and brick, with a thick domed or vaulted interior chamber that retained heat long after the fuel had burned out. The bread oven worked on a fundamentally different principle than the cooking fires. You did not bake bread over a flame. You heated the oven by burning a fire inside the chamber itself, typically a bundle of faggots, dry bundles of thin sticks bound together, which burned hot and fast and heated the stone to the required temperature. When the fire had burned down to embers, the baker raked the ash and coals out of the oven, a hot and smelly job, filling the bakehouse with ash and acrid smoke, and then, with practised speed, slid the shaped loaves inside on a long wooden peel, a flat paddle-like tool with a handle long enough to reach the back of the oven without burning the baker's hands or arms. The oven door was then sealed, sometimes with a wooden door fitted with a clay or mortar seal, sometimes simply with whatever was available, and the bread was left to bake in the declining heat of the masonry. Getting the temperature right was entirely a matter of experience, There were no thermometers, no dials, no reliable way to measure the heat inside the oven except by the baker's own accumulated knowledge of how his particular oven behaved. The classic test, pressing a handful of flour against the oven floor and watching whether it burned immediately, toasted slowly, or barely coloured at all, could indicate whether the oven was too hot, about right, or too cold, but it was the kind of judgment that only years of practice made reliable. A good baker knew his oven the way a rider knows a horse, not by reading its specifications, but by feel, by habit, by the subtle clues of smell and colour and sound that only long familiarity produced. The castle bakehouse produced several different kinds of bread, and the kind you received told you precisely who you were in the social order of the household. At the top of the hierarchy was manchet, a small, fine white bread made from the best, most finely milled wheat flour. Manchet was light, delicate, and expensive in terms of the grain it required, and it appeared on the high table where the lord and his noble guests ate. Just below it was a bread sometimes called a cheat loaf or a second loaf, still wheat, but less finely milled, less white, denser in texture. The further down the social scale you went, the coarser the bread became, moving through maslin, a blend of wheat and rye, to pure rye bread, to bread made from barley or oats, to the very roughest loaves produced from whatever combination of coarse grain and sometimes bean flour was available when supplies ran low. These lower grades of bread were what the castle's servants and retainers ate every day. Beyond its nutritional role, bread served another function in the 14th century that has no modern equivalent. It served as a plate. The trencher was a thick slice of bread, typically several days old, which made it harder and more resistant to soaking, on which other foods were placed and served. At a feast you might find sliced meat, stew, sauce, or fish served directly onto a trencher that sat on the wooden or metal plate in front of you. The bread absorbed the juices and sauces as you ate, and could itself be eaten at the end of the meal, though in a grand household the saturated trenchers were more commonly collected and given to the poor waiting at the castle gate, or fed to the castle's dogs and pigs. In a very grand household, wealthy guests might use actual wooden platters, or, at the very highest table, silver or pewter dishes beneath their trenchers. But the trencher itself remained universal. The bakehouse was also responsible for the more delicate baked goods that appeared at feasts and special occasions. Wafers were thin, crispy sheets of batter cooked between iron wafer irons held over coals, somewhat like a primitive waffle iron, and served at the end of meals with wine as a kind of closing sweetmeat. The wafer maker, where a household was large enough to have a dedicated specialist, was a position that required considerable dexterity and skill, since the irons had to be perfectly balanced in temperature, and the batter had to be applied in exactly the right quantity to produce a crisp, even sheet
without burning. Pastry cases, the thick, sturdy shells used to contain meat pies and other baked dishes, were another bakehouse product. In the early and middle 14th century, these pastry cases, sometimes called coffins, were not intended to be eaten. They were functional containers, heavy and utilitarian, designed to seal in their contents during baking and to survive the journey from kitchen to table intact. The edible short crust pastry that we associate with pie crust today did not appear clearly in English recipes until somewhat later. For now, the coffin was packaging, not food.
Before dawn, when the rest of the castle was still dark and quiet, the baker was already at work. Dough made the previous evening from water, flour, yeast, or more precisely, a piece of old dough kept from the previous day's batch, which contained the leavening organisms needed to make the new batch rise, had been left to prove overnight, covered with a cloth in a warm corner of the bakehouse. The baker would come in the dark, light his oven fire, and begin shaping the risen dough into loaves while the oven heated. By the time the first hint of morning light came in through the high, narrow window, the first batch would already be baking, and the smell of it, that warm, yeasty, incomparable smell of bread in a stone oven, would be drifting up the passage toward the great hall and spreading through the lower courtyards of the castle, soft and reassuring, like an announcement that the day had begun. Section 6. The Pantry, Larder, and the Buttery. Between the kitchen and the great hall, in the passage where the food made its crucial transition from production to service, 3 rooms stood watch. They were not glamorous rooms. They were functional, strictly ordered spaces where the work of an entire castle's eating and drinking was organised, stored and dispatched. The pantry, the larder, and the buttery. 3 distinct kingdoms, each with its own officer, each with its own logic, and together forming the supply infrastructure without which the grandest feast in the world would have been impossible. The pantry takes its name from the French word for bread, pain, because bread was originally its primary concern. The pantler, the officer in charge of the pantry, was responsible for receiving bread from the bakehouse, storing it appropriately, and distributing it to the table in the correct quantities and grades. The manchet loaves for the high table, the coarser loaves for the servants' meals, the trenchers to be cut and prepared for service. All of this passed through the pantler's hands. But the pantry's responsibilities extended beyond bread. It was also where the household's table linens were stored and managed. The long white cloths that covered the trestle tables in the great hall, the smaller cloths used to wrap bread for service, the napkins placed before honoured guests. The pantler was responsible for seeing that these were clean, properly folded, and available in adequate supply. In a large household, this was not a trivial task. Table linen in a noble household was costly, was consumed in considerable quantities, and required dedicated laundering staff to maintain. The larder was the cold storage room, And its name, like the pantries, tells you something about its original focus. Lard, fat, particularly the rendered fat of pigs, was fundamental to medieval cooking, and the larder was originally the place where it was kept. But by the 14th century, the larder's contents were considerably broader. This was where raw meat was received, salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved and stored. The hanging carcasses of sheep and pigs, the salted fish packed in barrels of brine, the dried and smoked legs of pork, the joints of beef rubbed with coarse salt and hung in the cool air, all of this was the larder's domain. The larderer was responsible for managing these stores with considerable care. He had to understand the principles of preservation well enough to ensure that food kept for weeks or months in the absence of refrigeration remained safe to eat, or at least safe enough. Salt was the primary preservative, applied in quantity to meat and fish, drawing out moisture and creating conditions hostile to the bacterial processes of decay. Smoking was used as a secondary preservation method for some meats, adding a chemical barrier as well as flavour. Drying, pickling in vinegar, and immersion in honey or fat were other methods in the larderer's toolkit. The larder needed to be cold, and the people who designed medieval castles understood this. Larders were sited away from the kitchen fires, typically on north-facing walls or in lower parts of the building where the temperature was naturally lower. Some larger establishments had separate cold storage structures built partly underground where the temperature remained cool through even the hottest summer months. The ice house, where ice cut from frozen ponds in winter was packed in straw and stored below ground, was another method of cold storage available to the grandest households, a remarkable piece of practical engineering that allowed perishable foods to be kept well into the summer months and gave the household the luxury of chilled drinks in warm weather. The buttery stands apart from both pantry and larder in that its contents were liquid. Despite the name, the buttery had nothing to do with butter. It was the room of the butt, the large wooden barrel used to store and age ale and wine. The butler was one of the most important domestic officers in any medieval household, and his responsibilities were taken seriously. He was accountable for the household's entire supply of drink, the ale brewed in the brewhouse, the wine imported in barrels and decanted into jugs for service, the spiced wines and mead that appeared at feasts. He managed the cellar beneath the buttery, where wine barrels rested in carefully maintained conditions. He supervised the cupbearers who carried drink to the table, and he was responsible for ensuring that the drink served at the high table was of appropriate quality and that the cups were always full. Wine in the 14th century was almost exclusively drunk young. The technical means of preserving wine for extended aging were not yet available, and wine that was more than a year or two old was typically considered inferior or spoiled. Wine arrived at the castle in barrels, imported from France. Bordeaux and Burgundy were both already significant sources of English imports during this period, and was decanted into jugs for table service. It might be served as it was, or it might be spiced with cinnamon, ginger, and honey to produce the sweet spiced wine called Hippocras,
which was considered both a luxury and a medicinal preparation. Hippocras appeared at the end of feasts, served with wafers from the bakehouse, as a closing course that signified the meal's conclusion. Together, the pantler, the larderer, and the butler controlled the flow of food and drink from storage to service, and their coordination with the kitchen was the logistical foundation of every meal. Nothing left the kitchen without passing through their domain. Nothing reached the table that they had not approved, counted, and dispatched. Section 7. The Brewhouse. Ale, wine, and the art of medieval drink.
Water, in the 14th century, was not reliably safe to drink. This is something modern people tend to state and then move past too quickly, without quite grasping what it meant in practical terms. It meant that the primary daily beverage consumed by every person in the castle, lord, knight, servant, scullion, and visiting guest alike, was not water, but ale. Ale was produced in the castle brewhouse, sometimes daily, in quantities that today seem staggering. It was not merely a luxury or a recreation. It was the fundamental liquid component of every meal, the thing drunk by everyone from the moment they woke until they went to sleep. And the brewhouse that produced it was accordingly one of the most important and most continuously active facilities in the entire castle complex. Medieval ale was different from modern beer in one crucial respect. It did not contain hops. The addition of hops to ale as a bittering and preserving agent did not become standard in England until the 15th century, and even then it was adopted slowly and unevenly, with considerable resistance from traditionalists who considered the resulting drink to be something different, hopped beer as opposed to traditional ale. 14th century ale was brewed from malted grain, most commonly barley, though oats and wheat were also used, combined with water and fermented with yeast. The resulting drink was relatively low in alcohol, sweet to malty in flavour, and without the bitterness that hops give to modern beers. It did not keep well. Brewed without hops, ale began to sour within days, which is why a large household's brewhouse was in almost constant operation, producing fresh batches to replace the rapidly deteriorating stock. The brewing process began with malting, soaking the barley grain in water until it began to germinate, then stopping the germination by drying the grain over heat. This malting process converted the grain's starches into fermentable sugars, which the yeast would later consume to produce alcohol. Malting was a skilled job, requiring careful attention to temperature and timing, and the maltster who managed it was responsible for the quality of every batch of ale that followed. Once malted, the grain was ground in the mill, the castle's own mill, powered by water or wind, and then mashed in large wooden or stone vats with hot water, extracting the sugars from the malt into a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was then boiled, cooled, and transferred to fermentation vessels where yeast was added. Within a day or two, the fermentation would be visibly active, the surface of the liquid bubbling and heaving with the activity
activity of millions of microscopic organisms converting sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide.
After fermentation, the ale was strained, transferred to barrels, and was ready to drink, usually within 3 to 5 days of the original mashing, which gives you some sense of how fresh and how continuously produced it needed to be. The brewhouse staff worked shifts that overlapped and continued through much of every day, beginning new batches while older ones were in fermentation, transferring finished ale to the buttery barrels while new wort was being prepared. The smell of the brewhouse was distinctive and pervasive, warm, yeasty, slightly sweet, with an undercurrent of the steam released during boiling. In cold weather, it was one of the warmest buildings in the castle complex, and the brewhouse workers were not immune to the occasional occupational hazard of breathing slightly too much of the yeasty air for extended periods. Different grades of ale were produced for different parts of the household, just as different grades of bread were baked for different ranks. The best ale, strong, fresh, carefully brewed, went to the high table. Lesser grades of ale went to the servants' tables. The very weakest ale, called small beer or second ale, produced by running additional water through the exhausted malt grain after the main wort had been extracted, was given to the lowest members of the household, and sometimes to the sick, since even weak ale was considered safer than water. Wine occupied a different position in the medieval drink hierarchy. It was the prestige beverage, the drink of the lord and his noble guests, expensive by comparison with ale, and exclusively consumed at the higher end of the social table. Wine did not come from English vineyards in any significant quantity. The climate of 14th century England was marginally better for viticulture than it is today, and there were some English vineyards, but the really serious wine came from France. The Gascon wine trade, from the area around Bordeaux, which was English territory through much of the 14th century, supplied English noble households with red wine in enormous quantities. Burgundy and Rhineland wines also made their appearance at the tables of the very wealthy. The butler's care in managing the wine supply was a genuine skill. Wine was valuable enough to be counted, monitored, and dispensed with care. Barrels were sealed against air exposure between pourings. Wine that had begun to turn to vinegar was repurposed for cooking. Verjuice, the acidic juice of unripe grapes or soured wine, was an important cooking ingredient, used in sauces and marinades throughout the medieval kitchen. Nothing was wasted that could be used. Mead, fermented honey and water, was less common in the 14th century English castle than it had been in earlier periods, but it still appeared at feasts and ceremonial occasions. Cider from apples and pears was drunk in households where orchards were part of the estate. Perry, from pears specifically, was a regional specialty in certain parts of England, and fruit juices, though generally consumed fresh and not fermented, were used both as drinks and as cooking ingredients. The entire apparatus of medieval drink, the brew house, the buttery, the cellar, the butler's careful records, reminds us that in a world without safe water, the production of safe drink was not a social nicety.
It was a matter of basic survival, and the people who managed it were providing one of the most essential services in the entire household. Section 8. Spices, Herbs, and the Language of Flavour. There is a persistent myth about medieval food, that it was heavily spiced, primarily to disguise the taste of meat that had gone rotten, that the cooks of the 14th century were engaged in a kind of aromatic deception, masking decay beneath avalanches of pepper and cinnamon. This is not true. It is, in fact, quite wrong in almost every particular, and understanding why it is wrong takes us to the heart of how medieval cooks actually thought about flavour, status, and the art of good cooking.
Spices in the 14th century were expensive, genuinely, extraordinarily expensive. Black pepper, the most common spice in use, cost roughly the equivalent of a labourer's daily wage for about 30 grams, which is a small tin's worth by modern standards. Saffron, the dried stigmas of the saffron crocus, required the hand harvesting of hundreds of flowers to produce a single gram, and was accordingly priced like the precious material it was. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, cardamom, mace, galangal, grains of paradise, all of these arrived in England after extremely long journeys from South and Southeast Asia and East Africa, passing through multiple intermediary markets, each adding to the price, before reaching the spice merchants of London and other English ports. This made them luxury goods of the first order, objects whose conspicuous use demonstrated wealth in the same way that fine fabrics or silver plate did. The use of spices in noble household cooking was therefore emphatically not a sign of desperation or concealment. It was a sign of status. A cook who used generous quantities of expensive spices in a dish was not hiding something. He was advertising something. He was announcing the wealth of his employer, the sophistication of his kitchen, the excellence of his provisions. Spoiled meat, by contrast, would not have been served at any table that maintained social pretensions, because the discovery of such a thing would have been a humiliation, a scandal, a failure of housekeeping that reflected directly and immediately on the lord of the castle. Food preservation was carefully managed precisely to avoid this outcome, and the spice chest was kept, sometimes literally, under lock and key, not because spices were used to disguise bad food, but because they were too valuable to leave unguarded. The spice chest was typically the responsibility of the chief cook, or the household's chief officer, and it was one of the carefully inventoried items that appeared in household accounts. Records of spice purchases survive from various 14th century English noble households and give us a precise picture of what was in common use. Ginger was probably the single most commonly used cooking spice, appearing in everything from meat dishes to sauces to sweet preparations. Cinnamon and its cheaper alternative, cassia, appeared constantly. Pepper was everywhere, used both in cooking and at the table. Cloves and mace added their distinctive aromatic notes to sauces and pottages. Saffron, however expensive,
was used with some regularity in the finest kitchens, particularly as a colouring agent. Its deep golden colour was considered beautiful and was used to give a rich, appetising appearance to rice dishes, sauces, and custards. Sugar itself, imported from the Mediterranean and the Middle East, was treated as a spice in this period, rather than as a bulk ingredient, used in relatively small quantities as a flavouring, sometimes combined with other spices in pre-mixed powders like the Duke's powder or fine spices that medieval recipes frequently call for.
Beyond the imported luxury spices, the castle kitchen had access to a kitchen garden, where herbs were grown with practical seriousness. Sage, rosemary, parsley, fennel, mint, marjoram, hyssop, and thyme were all common garden herbs that appeared regularly in cooking. Bay leaves came from the laurel tree, either grown in the garden or imported. These herbs were not merely flavouring. In the medical understanding of the time, which was closely tied to the theory of humours derived from classical Greek medicine, different herbs and spices were understood to have distinct physiological properties that affected the body's balance. Cooking was therefore not entirely separate from medicine in the medieval mind. The skilled cook who understood which spices were hot and dry in the second degree, and which were cold and moist in the first, and how combining them could produce a dish suited to a particular person's temperament or a particular season's requirements, that cook was practicing something that blended gastronomy with a kind of practical pharmacology. The flavours that resulted from medieval cooking were therefore quite different from what modern people might expect. The sweet-savoury combination that strikes contemporary palates as unusual was absolutely normal in 14th century cooking. Meat dishes regularly combined with dried fruit, sweetened with honey or sugar, sharpened with verjuice or vinegar, and spiced with cinnamon or ginger. A sauce for roasted meat might contain wine, spices, bread for thickening, and a quantity of honey. The goal was not simply to make food taste good in a general sense, but to create a specific profile of flavours, aromatic, complex, carefully balanced, that reflected the cook's skill and the household's resources. The herb garden adjacent to the kitchen was a working garden, not an ornamental one. It was planted in spring with care, tended through the summer, harvested through the growing season, and its produce was used fresh when available and dried for winter use when not. The smell of a well-maintained medieval herb garden in late summer, the combined scents of sage, rosemary, thyme and fennel warming in the afternoon sun, was and remains one of the most pleasant olfactory experiences available, and the cook who had good access to fresh herbs counted it as one of his most important resources. Drying herbs for winter use was a careful process. Bunches of cut herbs were hung from the rafters of a warm, dry room, sometimes the kitchen itself in a corner away from the steam, and left to desiccate slowly over several days. The dried herbs were then stripped from their stems, stored in ceramic or wooden containers with tight-fitting lids, and labelled for easy identification through the long months when nothing grew in the kitchen garden.
The difference in intensity between fresh and dried herbs was well understood by medieval cooks who adjusted quantities accordingly. Dried sage, for example, was used more sparingly than fresh, its flavour concentrated by the drying process into something stronger and more emphatic.
The trade in spices from the East was conducted through a chain of intermediaries so long and complex that it still challenges economic historians to trace in full. Spices originating in the Spice Islands, the Maluku Islands of what is now Indonesia, or in southern India, or along the East African coast, passed through Arab traders to the markets of Alexandria and Constantinople, then through Venetian or Genoese merchants to the commercial hubs of northern Italy, then through the Alpine passes, or by sea around the Iberian Peninsula to the markets of England. At each step, the goods changed hands, added to their price, and accumulated the accumulated costs of transport, storage, risk, and profit margin. By the time a bag of cloves reached a London spice merchant, it had travelled perhaps 15,000 miles and passed through a dozen hands, and its price reflected every mile and every intermediary. This extraordinary logistical chain was the supply infrastructure of medieval fine cooking, and the disruption of any part of it, war in the Levant, storms in the Mediterranean, political instability in Italy, could drive spice prices to even more extraordinary heights and leave castle kitchens short of the ingredients considered essential to fine cooking. The household steward who managed the castle's spice supply was therefore operating at the intersection of local food management and international trade, and his decisions about when to buy, in what quantities, and from which merchants were genuinely consequential for the quality of the household's table. The locked spice chest in the castle kitchen was not ceremonial. It was a practical necessity. Spices were small, high-value commodities that could be stolen in tiny quantities without the theft being immediately obvious, and the temptation for kitchen staff with access to them was real. The key to the spice chest was kept by the chief cook or the household steward, and access to the chest was carefully controlled. Quantities dispensed for each day's cooking were noted, and discrepancies between what had been dispensed and what had been used were noticed and investigated. In this way, the medieval spice chest was already anticipating what modern businesses call inventory management, the careful tracking of high-value materials from receipt to use to ensure that nothing was lost through theft, carelessness, or the quiet accumulation of small wastage over time. Section 9. Roasting, boiling, and the open fire. Cooking in the 14th century was, in its daily reality, a conversation between cook and flame, a constant, skillful negotiation with heat that could not be turned up or down by any adjustment of a dial, that varied with the type of wood burning, with the wind coming through the kitchen door, with the moisture content of the logs, with the position of the pot relative to the shifting centre of the fire. The cook who worked well under these conditions was genuinely skilled in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, because the variables were so numerous and the feedback from the food being cooked was the only reliable guide. The two fundamental methods of cooking over an open fire were roasting and boiling, and each served a different social function, as well as producing different results. Roasting, cooking meat on a spit before an open flame, was the prestige method, associated with the high table and with the consumption of whole joints or whole animals. Boiling, cooking in a pot of water or stock over the fire, was the everyday method, producing the pottages, stews, and boiled meats that fed the greater part of the household on most days. A good feast required both, in sequence: the roasted meats for the high table, the boiled pottages for the body of the hall, all produced simultaneously from different fires. The spit was a rod of iron, varying in length from a few feet for small birds to 10 or more feet for whole animals, tapered at one end to a point for piercing the meat, and squared or fitted with a handle at the other end for turning. The meat was threaded onto the spit, secured with iron skewers or twisted binding wire to prevent it from slipping and spinning around the spit without actually rotating, and then positioned before the fire on forked iron supports called spit dogs, or on adjustable brackets fixed into the masonry of the fireplace. The distance from the fire was carefully judged. Too close, and the outside of the meat would char before the inside cooked. Too far, and the heat would be insufficient for efficient roasting.
Then the turning began. Roasting meat required continuous rotation, a quarter turn at regular intervals, maintained without interruption for the entire cooking time of the joint, which for a large piece of beef might be several hours. This rotation was the job of the spit boy, one of the youngest and lowest ranking members of the kitchen staff, often a child of 10 or 11 years, positioned directly in front of the fire for hours on end, their face red and raw with heat, their hands cramped around the turning handle, with no task in the world except to keep the spit moving at the right speed. The heat they endured was considerable. The front of a large roasting fire in an enclosed stone kitchen was an intensely hot environment, and the spit boy, sitting 3 feet from it, had no shelter from it except the occasional rotation away from direct facing. Burns were common. Exhaustion was constant. It was, by any measure, one of the hardest physical jobs in the kitchen, and it fell to the youngest and most powerless people in the room.
Below the spit, a dripping pan caught the fat that rendered out of the meat as it cooked. This fat was not wasted. It was basted back onto the meat periodically to keep it moist, or collected and stored for use as a cooking fat or a leather conditioner. Nothing in a medieval kitchen that had any possible use was thrown away without consideration. The smells produced by this roasting, the complex fragrance of rendering fat, of browning meat proteins, of the herbs or aromatics sometimes stuffed into the cavity of a roasting bird, were rich and pervasive, penetrating even the passage to the great hall above, preceding the arrival of the food itself in a way that was almost certainly deliberate, building
appetite and anticipation in the assembled company long before the first platter arrived.
Boiling was less dramatic, but more fundamental. The great iron cauldrons that hung over the boiling hearths produced day after day the pottages that formed the basis of most people's diet. Pottage, from the Old French potage, meaning something cooked in a pot, was not a single dish, but an entire category, ranging from thin gruel to thick, meaty, heavily spiced preparations that would not have embarrassed a fine table. The simplest pottages were made from grain, vegetables, and water. The better ones added meat, stock, herbs, and whatever spices the household could afford. Frumenty, a classic medieval pottage made from hulled wheat cooked slowly in water or stock, then enriched with almond milk, eggs, and spices, was considered a distinguished dish and appeared regularly at fine tables as an accompaniment to roasted venison. It required hours of slow cooking, the wheat absorbing the liquid gradually and swelling to a creamy, porridge-like consistency that was fragrant with cinnamon and saffron. Alongside roasting and boiling, frying over a pan of fat was used for smaller items, the fritters, pasties, and small cakes that appeared at feasts and special occasions. Baking in the stone oven produced the pies, tarts, and pastry cases we have already discussed. And there was a method that might broadly be called braising, cooking meat in a small amount of liquid in a covered vessel, either in the embers of the fire or in the oven, which produced particularly tender results, well suited to tougher cuts or older animals. Each method required its own knowledge, its own equipment, its own relationship to the fire, and a fully capable kitchen worker was expected to be proficient in all of them. The sounds of a working medieval kitchen, produced by all of this activity happening simultaneously, would have been extraordinary. The crackle and spit of the roasting fire, the low, steady roll of boiling water in the great cauldrons, the rapid, rhythmic thud of knives on wooden boards, the grinding percussion of the mortar and pestle, always somewhere in the background, producing the pounded spice blends and herb pastes that went into half a dozen preparations at once. The hiss of liquid hitting a hot pan, the occasional shout of the chief cook cutting through all of it with an instruction or a correction. The kitchen was never quiet while it was working, and it was working for most of the hours between long before dawn and well into the evening. Section 10. Sauces, pottages, and the art of medieval recipes. The food of the 14th century castle kitchen was considerably more sophisticated than its reputation suggests. The popular image of medieval eating, large unadorned joints of meat torn apart with unwashed hands by people with no concept of culinary refinement, is a fantasy that the actual evidence, including a number of surviving medieval recipe collections, thoroughly contradicts. Medieval cooking in a noble household was elaborate, skilled, and governed by aesthetic principles that were taken seriously by the people who practiced them. The most important surviving English recipe collection from the 14th century is known as the Form of Cury, the title meaning roughly the method of cooking. Compiled around 1390, reportedly by the master cooks of King Richard II.
It contains nearly 200 recipes, and reading them reveals a cuisine of considerable complexity. Dishes combining meat with fruit, sauces built from toasted bread, wine and spices, delicate preparations of fish with almond milk and ginger, elaborate baked dishes using eggs and cream and expensive imported ingredients. This was not simple peasant food. This was a cuisine designed to impress, to display skill and resources, and to produce flavours that were genuinely considered beautiful by the people who ate them. Sauces occupied a special place in medieval cooking, and the sauce cook was accordingly a figure of some importance in the kitchen hierarchy. Medieval sauces were not the smooth, butter-enriched preparations of later classical French cooking. They were typically built on a base of toasted or soaked bread, ground to a smooth consistency in the mortar, then moistened with wine, verjuice, or stock, and flavoured with combinations of spices that created complex, layered results. Cameline sauce, named for its warm cinnamon brown colour like a camel's coat, was one of the most celebrated sauces of the medieval period, appearing in multiple recipe collections. Made from wine, vinegar, and a blend of cinnamon, ginger, cloves, cardamom, and mace, thickened with bread and sweetened with honey, it was served with roasted meat and game birds, and represented the kind of balanced, multi-layered flavour profile that the best medieval cooking aspired to.
Verjuice, from the French verjus, meaning green juice, was another fundamental preparation. Made from the pressed juice of unripe grapes, or alternatively from sour crab apples, verjuice was the medieval cook's primary acid, serving the function that lemon juice serves in much modern cooking. It appeared in sauces, marinades, and anywhere a bright, sharp note was needed to cut through the richness of meat or the sweetness of spiced preparations. The castle's gardens sometimes grew the sour grape varieties used for verjuice, and in apple-growing regions, crab apple verjuice was a standard kitchen preparation made in autumn and preserved through the year. Blancmange, which in the 14th century bore little resemblance to the sweet white dessert that later borrowed the name, was one of the signature preparations of refined medieval cooking. The original blancmange was a savoury dish made from shredded white meat, typically chicken, cooked with rice, almond milk, sugar and salt to a creamy, pale consistency that was then moulded or presented in a decorative form. The name simply means white food, and the emphasis on whiteness was deliberate. White foods were associated with purity, refinement, and high social status. The preparation of almond milk, made by blanching almonds, grinding them finely in the mortar, and then pressing the ground paste through a cloth with water, was a standard technique that appeared in dozens of medieval recipes and required considerable time and effort. Mortreuse was another characteristic medieval preparation, a paste of pounded meat or fish mixed with bread, eggs and spices, formed into balls or spread on trenchers, sometimes coloured with saffron or with the juice of parsley to produce decorative presentations. The technique of pounding meat to a fine paste in the mortar before incorporating other ingredients reflected a particular medieval aesthetic preference for smooth, fine-textured food over coarse, rough preparations. Medical theory supported this preference. It was believed that finely processed food was more easily absorbed by the body and was therefore more suitable for people of delicate constitution or high social rank.
coarse food was considered appropriate for the bodies of labourers who performed heavy physical work, while the refined and highly processed foods of the castle kitchen were thought to be better suited to the refined bodies of the nobility. This medical philosophy shaped not just the texture of medieval food, but its flavour profiles, its colour choices, and even the way meals were structured over the course of a day. Foods were categorised as hot, cold, moist or dry in various degrees, and the ideal meal was one that presented a balanced combination of these qualities across its courses, adjusted for the season, the weather, and the particular humoral constitution of the diners. A cook who understood these principles was not just a craftsman, he was a practitioner of a systematic philosophy of nourishment, and his work in the kitchen was informed by a body of knowledge that connected the fire and the mortar to the body and the soul of every person at the table. Section 11. The Gardens, Hunting and the Supply Chain.
A castle kitchen did not operate in isolation. It was the end point of an elaborate supply chain, a web of sources, routes, and relationships that brought food in from the surrounding landscape, from distant markets, and from the castle's own carefully managed agricultural resources. Understanding where the food came from is as important as understanding what was done with it once it arrived, and the people who managed the supply side of a castle's food production were as essential to the system as the cooks who transformed raw ingredients into finished dishes. The kitchen garden was the most immediate and most reliable source of fresh ingredients, and it was typically located within or immediately adjacent to the castle walls, in a position where it could be tended by dedicated gardeners and protected from casual theft. Kitchen gardens in medieval English noble households were planned with a practical eye. Vegetables, herbs, and soft fruits that could be harvested throughout the growing season and used fresh in the kitchen. Onions and garlic were fundamental. They appeared in virtually every savoury preparation and were grown in large quantities. Leeks were important and widely grown. Cabbages, turnips, parsnips, and other root vegetables were grown for both kitchen use and for storage. Peas and beans provided both fresh pods in summer and dried legumes for winter stews. Spinach, chard, and other leafy greens appeared seasonally. Sorrel, with its sharp acidic flavour, was valued as an ingredient in sauces and potages. The herb portion of the kitchen garden was taken with particular seriousness. Sage, rosemary, thyme, parsley, fennel, hyssop, borage, rue, and dozens of other herbs were cultivated with care, their positions in the garden organised by habit, height, and usage. Some herbs required more warmth than the English climate naturally provided, and were grown against south-facing walls where the stone absorbed heat during the day and radiated it at night, creating a microclimate more hospitable to Mediterranean plants. The gardener who managed the kitchen garden was an important household figure, responsible for planning plantings, maintaining soil quality, managing irrigation, and delivering regular supplies to the kitchen throughout the growing season. Beyond the kitchen garden,
The castle's agricultural estate provided grain, dairy products, and livestock. The home farm attached to most significant noble residences produced wheat and barley for flour and brewing, hay for the horses, straw for bedding, and vegetables on a larger scale than the kitchen garden alone could supply. Dairy cattle provided milk, cream, butter, and cheese. Pigs were kept and fattened, their slaughter in autumn producing the salt pork and lard that sustained the household through the winter months. Sheep provided not only wool, but mutton. Chickens, geese, and ducks were kept in the castle yard, providing eggs throughout the year and birds for the pot on a regular basis.
Fishing was another important source of food, and castles positioned near rivers or the sea had the advantage of access to fresh fish at regular intervals. The church's calendar of fasting imposed a requirement to abstain from meat on Fridays, on Saturdays in some traditions, during Lent, and on the vigils of major feast days. And in the 14th century, these fasting days collectively amounted to roughly a third of the year. This created an enormous demand for fish as a substitute for meat, and the management of fish supplies was accordingly a serious logistical concern for any large household. Many castle estates included fish ponds, artificial ponds, sometimes quite large, stocked with freshwater fish that could be harvested as needed. Carp, pike, tench, and bream were common fish pond species. River fishing added salmon, trout, and eel. Sea fish, herring, cod, and various flatfish were available salted and dried from coastal markets, preserved in brine in barrels, and transported inland to provide the fish supply during the weeks when fresh fish was unavailable. The hunt contributed significantly to the castle's food supply, and it was valued not merely as a food source, but as a noble pastime and a demonstration of the lord's rights over his forests and game. Venison, deer meat, was among the most prized of all medieval meats, and the right to hunt deer was a privilege of rank carefully protected by forest law. Boar, when available, was another prestigious quarry. Game birds, pheasant, partridge, woodcock, snipe, and various species of duck and other waterfowl were taken with hawks and with nets, and the poulterer received them in considerable variety throughout the hunting season. Hunting also contributed hares, rabbits, and a range of smaller animals that appeared in pottages and pies. Long-distance trade brought in the luxury ingredients that the castle's own resources could not supply. Spices, as we have already discussed, arrived from distant sources through the London merchants. Imported wine came from France and Germany. Almonds, figs, dates, and raisins arrived from the Mediterranean. Rice, a luxury grain in 14th century England, used in refined preparations like blancmange and rice pottage, was imported from Italy or Spain. Honey came from the castle's own hives or from local purchase. Sugar was imported at considerable cost. The travelling merchants who brought these goods to the castle's gates were welcomed not merely as traders, but as lifelines to the wider world of ingredients that raised the castle's cooking above the level of what the local landscape alone could provide. Section 12. Preparing for the Great Feast.
On most days, the castle kitchen operated to a reliable rhythm. The ordinary meals of a large household, organised and executed with practised efficiency, feeding 100 or more people twice a day without drama. But the great feast was something altogether different. A feast was theatre, and the kitchen was its backstage, its rehearsal room, its frantic and brilliant machinery, working at a pitch of intensity that made the ordinary day look relaxed. Great feasts in a 14th century noble household were occasions of genuine social importance. They marked the major festivals of the church calendar: Christmas, Easter, Whitsun, and the feast days of significant saints. They celebrated arrivals and departures of important guests, the conclusion of political alliances, the marking of births and deaths and marriages in the Lord's family. They were occasions on which the wealth and hospitality of the household were displayed to anyone who was present, and the quality of the food served was a direct statement of the Lord's status and generosity. A mean feast reflected badly on the man who gave it. A magnificent feast enhanced his reputation and his relationships. The kitchen staff understood this. The pressure was real.
Preparation for a significant feast began days in advance. The chief cook and the household steward would confer about the menu, deciding how many courses would be served, what would appear in each course, how many dishes the kitchen could realistically produce at the necessary quality level, and what special ingredients needed to be ordered or reserved from the stores. A great feast in a noble household of the 14th century might involve 2, 3, or even 4 courses, each course consisting of multiple dishes presented simultaneously on the table, not in the sequential manner of modern course-by-course service, but all at once, in an abundant and visually spectacular arrangement. The number of dishes in each course and the quality and rarity of the ingredients involved were calibrated to the importance of the occasion and the rank of the guests. Once the menu was fixed, the practical work began. Supplies were checked, and any shortfalls addressed by immediate purchase or requisition. Live birds destined for slaughter were identified and kept separate. Pastry cases were begun several days ahead. They needed time to bake properly and could be made in advance without deteriorating. The great boiled preparations, the stock that formed the base of sauces and pottages, the almond milk required in quantity for various preparations, were made in advance and kept cool. Spices were measured, counted, locked away in carefully portioned quantities so that nothing was wasted or misused in the heat of production.
On the day of the feast, the kitchen began its work hours before the meal was due to be served. Perhaps 4 or 5 hours for a moderately elaborate feast, longer for an exceptional occasion. The fires were built up early, their heat managed from the first light of morning. The chief cook moved between the different sections of the kitchen, checking, adjusting, issuing instructions with the calm authority of long experience. The roasting hearths were loaded with their spits, and the turning began. The cauldrons went on with their stocks and pottages.
the pastry cook completed and filled his pies and slides them into the oven. The sauce cook began his preparations, his mortar going steadily, the smell of spices and wine rising from his corner of the kitchen. As the mealtime approached, the pace intensified. The timing of a large feast required something close to military precision, because every dish had to arrive at the high table at approximately the right moment. Not too early, growing cold in the passage, and not too late, leaving the assembled company waiting. The kitchener, a senior officer responsible for the overall coordination of the meal service, was the essential figure in these final hours, standing at the kitchen door with the authority to hold or release dishes, coordinating the flow of food from kitchen to hall with a judgment built on years of experience and an intimate knowledge of how quickly each preparation could move from fire to table.
The carver was the Lord's personal servant, responsible for cutting and portioning the meat at the high table, a skilled position that required knowledge of anatomy, dexterity with a knife, and the social confidence to perform the task in public in front of the assembled company with grace and efficiency. The servitors, the serving staff who carried the dishes from kitchen to hall, moved in procession through the covered passage, each carrying a platter covered with a cloth to retain heat, their route and their order carefully organized so that the different elements of each course arrived together. This procession was itself a form of ceremony, part of the feast's theatre. The covered dishes, the solemn progress through the hall, the placement of the food before the assembled company with appropriate ceremony. In the great hall, the food appeared as if spontaneously produced by the castle's abundance. The magnificent roasted meats, the golden pottages fragrant with saffron, the elaborate pies with their decorated pastry lids, the sauces in their silver boats, the spiced wines and the wafers. The table groaned, literally in the case of the heaviest wooden trestles under the weight of the platters, with food. And none of it could be traced by the people eating it back to the extraordinary labour and skill and organisational complexity that had produced it. That invisibility was itself part of the feast's magic. The kitchen had done its job perfectly.
The presentation of food at a medieval feast was itself an art form that the kitchen staff took seriously. Dishes were not simply cooked and carried to the table. They were arranged, decorated, and coloured to create visual effects that complemented their flavours. Saffron gave dishes a rich golden colour, considered beautiful and prestigious. Sandalwood produced a deep red in certain preparations. Ground herbs or the juice of parsley produced vivid greens. A dish of blancmange might be divided into quarters of alternating white and gold, the gold produced by saffron, and garnished with whole almonds or decorated with patterns made from darker spices. Whole roasted birds were sometimes redressed in their own feathers before service, a technique that required considerable skill in the dressing and the presentation, so that a roasted swan or peacock arrived at the great table looking, from a distance, almost alive. The
The subtlety was another form of feast spectacle unique to the medieval great table. Subtleties were elaborate sculptural creations made from sugar paste, marzipan, or occasionally pastry, fashioned into the shapes of castles, ships, animals, heraldic emblems, or figures representing saints or allegories. They were placed at the end of a course as both visual centerpiece and closing sweetmeat, and in the grandest households they could be objects of extraordinary ambition, entire scenes with multiple figures, or representations of the Lord's coat of arms rendered in coloured sugar. They were rarely eaten in full. Their function was as much theatrical as culinary, but they were passed around for guests to admire and pick at, and the skill that produced them was genuinely regarded as a form of artistry.
Organising a feast also required careful thought about the order in which dishes were served and the proportions of different types of food in each course. Medieval feast menus were organised to present dishes of varying types: roasted meats, boiled meats, fish preparations, pies, vegetable dishes, within each course in a manner that demonstrated abundance and variety. The first course of a significant feast might include a pottage, a roasted joint, a boiled fish preparation, a pie, and a sauce. The second course might offer another combination of roasted birds, a baked preparation, a vegetable dish, and a cold preparation from the garde-manger. The third course would bring the sweet preparations: custards, fritters, spiced wines, wafers, and the subtlety that concluded the meal. This structure was not rigid, but it followed recognizable conventions that experienced diners understood, and departing from them in interesting ways was itself a form of culinary statement. The kitchen staff who produced all of this knew, in the quiet professional way of people who do their best work invisible to the people they serve, that they had done something remarkable. When the last platter had gone up the passage, and the noise from the great hall above indicated that the assembled company was satisfied, there was a particular moment in the kitchen, a brief pause in the sustained intensity of the day, that felt like the taking of a collective breath. Not celebration, not exactly, something quieter and more private than that. The knowledge that the thing had been done, and done well. That was enough. Section 13. The Scullions and the Lowest Rung. We have spoken of the chief cook and the specialist craftsman of the medieval kitchen, the figures whose skill and authority made the whole system work. But the system could not have functioned for a single day without the people at the very bottom of its hierarchy. The scullions, the kitchen boys, the nameless and largely unrecorded young people who did the hardest, most repetitive, most physically punishing work of all. The word scullion comes from an old French word meaning roughly a dirty or disreputable person, which tells you something about how this role was perceived by those who used the word. Scullions were young boys, typically between 10 and 14 years of age, though the category was flexible, who had been placed in the castle kitchen either by a parent seeking a position for a child, or through some arrangement with the household steward, and whose days were defined by an unbroken series of tasks that required physical stamina, tolerance for discomfort,
and very little of the specialised skill that marked the upper reaches of the kitchen hierarchy.
The central and most defining task of the scullion was washing. Pots, pans, cauldrons, spits, trivets, bowls, platters, ladles, strainers, the enormous quantity of cooking and serving equipment that a busy castle kitchen deployed every day had to be cleaned after each use, and this cleaning was done in water heated to near boiling temperature, using sand, ash, and whatever abrasive materials were available as scouring agents. The pots used in medieval cooking, heavy iron cauldrons, thick-sided copper saucepans, large bronze roasting pans, were not easy objects to clean. They were thick-walled and heavy, difficult to move when full of hot water, and prone to acquiring layers of burned food and rendered fat that required determined and repetitive scrubbing to remove. The sand used for scouring was rough enough to be effective against burned deposits, but also hard enough on unprotected hands to produce deep, painful cracking and splitting of the skin. Scullions' hands were generally a reliable indicator of their occupation. Red, raw, cracked at the knuckles, occasionally bleeding where the splitting had gone deep enough. Beyond pot washing, the scullion's day included carrying water, an endless, literally back-breaking task in a kitchen that consumed enormous quantities of water for cooking, cleaning, and the various other processes that went on throughout the day. Water came from the castle's well or cistern, carried in heavy wooden buckets, and the distance between the water source and the kitchen could be considerable, depending on the castle's layout. Multiple trips, multiple times a day were the standard requirement. The weight of a full wooden bucket, perhaps 12 to 15 litres of water, which is 12 to 15 kilograms, pulling on a child's arm and shoulder for the length of the castle courtyard, was a recurring physical challenge that left its mark on the bodies of those who did it regularly. The scullion also disposed of waste. A busy castle kitchen generated a remarkable quantity of refuse: bones, offal from slaughtered animals, vegetable trimmings, burned material scraped from pots, fat residue, spoiled food removed from storage, ash from the fires. All of this needed to be removed from the kitchen regularly and transported to the waste pits or midden that every castle maintained at a distance from the main buildings. The smell of this work was something that only gradual habituation made tolerable, and the habituation came quickly enough in the life of someone who did it every day. Burns were the occupational hazard that no scullion escaped entirely. Working in a kitchen where multiple open fires burned simultaneously, where boiling water was moved in vessels that were never designed for comfortable handling, where hot fat spattered from roasting pans and hot coals could fall from fire irons, burns were inevitable. Minor ones were constant,
quick scald from a splash of hot liquid, the brief contact with a hot metal handle, the foot burned by an ember knocked from the hearth in passing. More serious burns occurred with depressing regularity, and the treatment available in the 14th century was limited primarily to the application of whatever herbs and preparations the castle's medical practitioners had available. Beeswax, various herb poultices, goose fat applied to scalded skin.
And yet the scullion's life was not without its compensations, small and specific as they were. The kitchen was the warmest room in the castle, and a scullion sleeping near the banked embers of the hearth at night was more comfortable than many of his social superiors sleeping in unheated chambers above. The kitchen was where the food was, and scullions had a tacit claim on what remained after the rest of the household had been served. The scrapings from pots, the broken pieces of bread, the bits of meat left on bones after carving, the thick bottom of the pottage cauldron. These were humble foods, but in a world where the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine hunger was real and ever-present, access to the residue of a noble household's cooking was a genuine advantage. Scullions grew up in the kitchen, and if they survived and showed aptitude, could begin to advance from scullion to kitchen boy to one of the more skilled assistant roles, the ladder of the kitchen hierarchy rising above them in at least theoretical accessibility. They were never celebrated. No minstrel sang of the boy who turned the spit for 6 hours in a smoke-filled room, and then spent the rest of the evening scrubbing cauldrons with sand. No chronicle recorded their names. They were background figures in a world that was entirely dependent on their labour, and they disappeared into the past without trace, as most people do. But in any honest account of what the castle kitchen was and how it functioned, their presence is essential. The gleaming feast that arrived in the great hall above, the roasted meats, the golden pottages, the spiced wines and decorated pies, was built in part on the cracked and reddened hands of children whose names we do not know. Section 14. Nights in the Kitchen, the long wind down. The feast was over. The great hall had been loud with voices and music for several hours, the trestle tables groaning under platters that the servitors had carried back and forth until every course had been presented, every dish depleted, every wine jug emptied and refilled and emptied again. Now, gradually, the noise was subsiding. The musicians had finished their last piece. The important guests had been led to their guest chambers. The lord had retired. The candles in the great hall were being snuffed one by one, and the vast space was settling into its nightly quiet. But in the kitchen below, the work was not finished. After any significant meal, and especially after a feast, the clearing up was extensive and time-consuming. Every pot and pan that had been used in preparation needed to be washed. The great cauldrons that had held pottage for several hours had to be scrubbed out while still warm enough for the residue to be removed. a task that became much more difficult if left until the next morning, when everything had cooled and hardened. The spits had to be cleaned and replaced on their brackets. The cutting boards had to be scrubbed. The floor of the kitchen, which by the end of a busy day had accumulated a patina of fat drippings, scattered herbs, ash, and the general residue of hours of intensive cooking, had to be swept out, and, in the better appointed kitchens, washed down through the drainage channel.
The distribution of leftover food occupied the kitchen staff's attention as the clearing up proceeded. Food from the high table, the expensive, carefully prepared dishes that had been presented to the Lord and his guests, was given according to a defined hierarchy of redistribution. Some went to the castle's own servants in the forms that remained after table service. What the servants' meal did not absorb went to the poor who had gathered, as they gathered every day at the castle gate in expectation of the leftovers from the great household's table. The trenchers, saturated with the sauces and juices of the high table's meats, were particularly valued in this distribution. They were more than mere soggy bread. They were the accumulated flavour of a meal that would otherwise have been entirely beyond the reach of anyone waiting outside the gate. Giving away the saturated trenchers was an act of charity that was also practical, and it was taken seriously in a world where Christian obligation to the poor was understood as both a religious duty and a social expectation. The fires required careful management at the end of the day. They were not extinguished. Building a fire from cold each morning would have been wasteful and time-consuming, and the embers of a properly banked fire would retain enough heat to provide the basis for a quickly rebuilt blaze the following morning. Banking the fire, covering the live embers with a thick layer of ash to restrict airflow and prevent them from burning down entirely overnight, was a specific skill, and the person responsible for the overnight fire was one of the few kitchen staff who slept in the kitchen itself rather than in the servants' quarters of the castle. Someone had to remain awake, or at least lightly sleeping, near the hearth, ready to check that the banked fire had not smouldered out entirely, or, at the other extreme, had not found enough air to leap back into a dangerous blaze. This fire watch person, the lowest status kitchen worker assigned the overnight duty in rotation, slept on a pallet near the hearth, wrapped in a rough blanket, the warm glow of the banked fire providing enough light to see by and enough heat to make the stone floor tolerable. Above them, the walls of the kitchen gleamed faintly with the residual warmth of the stone, which had spent all day absorbing heat from the fireplaces and was now slowly releasing it back into the room. The cauldrons on their hooks were still, the spits were still, the mortar was empty on its shelf. The kitchen, which had been the loudest and busiest room in the castle for the past 15 hours, was finally, briefly, quiet. Not entirely quiet. The embers in the hearth made small sounds. The occasional soft
collapse of a piece of charred wood, a tiny hiss of steam from a wet log's last moisture, the gentle crackling of cooling iron. Outside, through the narrow windows, the night sounds of the castle drifted in. The distant bark of a dog somewhere in the outer courtyard, the cry of a night bird from the trees beyond the wall, the periodic clank of the night watchman's equipment as he made his rounds along the battlements. The kitchen held its warmth against the October darkness outside, and the person sleeping near the hearth turned slowly on the straw pallet, pulled the blanket closer, and drifted deeper into sleep. Tomorrow, before dawn, long before, in fact, while the castle was still dark and silent, the baker would come in first. He would check the overnight embers, build his oven fire from the banked coals, begin the long day's first work. Then the others, one by one. The kitchen boys first, then the undercooks, then the specialist cooks, then the chief cook making his first round of the kitchen as the light came up and the fires were built and the first smells of the day began to rise from the pots. The chief cook would cast his eye over what was in store, think about what the steward had told him the Lord required for the day, and begin to plan. The kitchen would wake again into its ordinary noise and warmth and productivity, and the whole intricate system would run forward once more. The leftover scraps from last night's clearing, set aside in a covered bowl, would go to the hounds. The ash from the banked fire would be raked out and added to the ash pile outside, to be mixed eventually with water and fat to make the lye soap used for washing. The water carrier would make his first trip of the day before full daylight, the bucket handles creaking as he walked. The baker's first loaves would be in the oven before anyone upstairs was stirring. And so the kitchen would begin again, as it had every day before, as it would every day to come. Section 15. The slow permanence of it all. There is a particular quality to very old stone, a quality that is difficult to describe, but that anyone who has spent time in historic buildings will recognize. It is not simply age. It is something more than age, a kind of accumulated presence, a weight of absorbed time that makes itself felt in the air of the room, in the temperature of the walls, in the particular quality of silence that settles when all the visitors have gone and the building is left to itself. Stand in the kitchen of Glastonbury Abbey today, that perfectly preserved 14th century building with its octagonal lantern and its corner fireplaces and its thick stone walls still darkened faintly by 6 centuries of cooking smoke, and you will feel it. The room is empty, and the fires are cold, and there has been no cooking here for hundreds of years. But the stone remembers. Not in any mystical sense, but in the most literal and physical one. The shape of the fireplaces is still there. The grooves worn in the floor by the passage of feet still there.
the proportions of the room designed for a specific human purpose, still telling you quietly what that purpose was. This is a place where people cooked. Every surface says so. In the kitchens of the great English castles, Kenilworth, Porchester, Windsor, the Palace of Westminster, the surviving kitchen spaces, however ruined or altered, carry a similar quality of accumulated meaning. These were not ornamental spaces. They were working rooms, and the work they did was the work of sustaining life, feeding people every day, regardless of the weather outside or the politics above, regardless of whether the Lord was in residence or away on campaign, regardless of whether there was a feast or only a plain supper of bread and pottage. The kitchen worked because the castle had to eat, and it worked without stopping, and the people who worked in it poured years of their lives into those fires and those pots and that daily production of food.
Most of their names are lost. The chief cook who served John of Gaunt at Kenilworth in the 1370s is not recorded by name in the documents that survive. The spit boys who stood before those fires have left no trace. The scullions who scrubbed those cauldrons, the pantlers who counted the manchet loaves, the brewers who produced the thousands of gallons of ale consumed over decades of household operation, they are gone from the record as completely as they are from living memory. What remains is the stone, the hearth, the floor drain, the height of the ceiling above the main fire, designed by someone who understood how heat and smoke move through an enclosed space, and who solved that problem 500 years before we arrived to admire the solution. What the 14th century castle kitchen represents, beyond its historical interest, beyond the fascinating specifics of its food and its hierarchy and its architecture, is something worth pausing on in these quiet moments before sleep. It represents the immense, quiet confidence of ordinary life, not the heroic and the celebrated, not the deeds that made it into chronicles and songs, but the daily and unremarked work of keeping people fed and sheltered and warm. The work that was invisible precisely because it was done so well, so consistently, so reliably that the people it served never had to think about it.
The cook, who had spent 20 years mastering the art of managing a castle kitchen's dozen fires and 40 staff, and daily production of food for 100-person household, was practicing something real and demanding and difficult, something that required intelligence, experience, organizational skill, creativity, and physical stamina in equal measure. The baker, who had developed over years the intimate knowledge of his particular oven's behavior, knowing that the left side ran slightly hotter than the right, that oak burned longer than ash, that the dough needed slightly less time on a humid day, was a craftsman of genuine ability. The sauce cook, grinding spices in the mortar to precisely the texture required by a particular preparation. The larderer, making the judgment calls about what preserved meat was still good and what had to be discarded. The brewer,
managing the daily production of the household's ale supply with the consistency that hundreds of people's health depended on. All of these were people doing skilled, important, demanding work. And the food they produced was real food, not simple food, not crude food, carefully thought about, skillfully prepared food that was, by the evidence of surviving recipes, considerably more sophisticated than its reputation suggests. The form of cury and the other medieval recipe collections that have come down to us describe a cuisine with its own aesthetic principles, its own techniques, its own considered relationship to flavour, texture, colour, and the physical and social meaning of what people eat. The people who created that food were not primitive. They were working within their own tradition, with their own materials, toward their own ideals of what good food looked and tasted and meant.
The castle kitchen was the place where all of this happened, day after day, in the warmth and the smoke and the noise and the perpetual motion of open fire. It was the engine of the castle's daily life, more essential in its daily functioning than any sword or banner or diplomatic seal. It was full of people, full of hierarchy and politics and small injustices and occasional moments of genuine craft and pleasure, full of smells and sounds and the particular texture of exhausting, repetitive, important work. And it is largely forgotten, as the unglamorous essential things tend to be. But when you visit those old stone kitchens, when you stand in the spaces where the fires burned and let the stone speak in its quiet way, when you notice the height of the chimney and the placement of the drainage channel and the particular worn smoothness of the floor in front of the main hearth, you are in contact with something real and human and very old. Not the fiction of medieval life, not the romance of knights and castles in the way they appear in songs and illuminations, but the actual texture of it. The smell of wood smoke and rendered fat, the sound of the mortar and the crackle of the fire, the warmth on your face as you lean toward the hearth, and the patient, daily, invisible miracle of bread baking in the dark before dawn. That is the kitchen of a 14th century castle. Not the brightest room in the castle, not the most celebrated, but perhaps, in the end, the truest one. Tonight, let that warmth come with you into sleep. The fire is banked, the pots are clean, the bread is proving in its warm corner for tomorrow's morning. The night watchman has made his rounds, and the castle is quiet. Let the weight of the stone walls, the long, slow heat of the embers, and the deep, accumulated quiet of very old rooms settle over you like a blanket. The kitchen has done its work for today. The day is done. Everything that needed to happen happened, as it always does, as it has always done, in the particular patience of the very old world. Rest now. The fire will still be there in the morning. If this slow journey through the kitchens of a 14th century castle has helped you find your way to sleep, it would mean so much if you could take a moment before you drift off completely to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I have been working on Hayo,
boring history for sleep for over a year now, and this community, small and quiet as it still is something I genuinely care about. Around 160 people subscribe to this channel at the time of recording this, and every single one of you is why I keep going. If you would like to support the channel further, the links are below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one, somewhere deep in history, warm and very, very slow.